The title of my brief remarks today is Money, Deficits, Democracy, and the Devil. Sometimes the best economists are not economists. One of the most famous plays in Western history was written by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. His play, Faust, is considered one of the greatest works of German literature. This complicated and sometimes disturbing text tells the story of a young professor, Faust, who enters into a pact with the devil. In return for the devil's services, Faust wagers the devil his soul. At one point of Goethe's play, he makes a surprising excursion into economics. Accompanied by the devil, Faust visits an emperor whose empire is facing financial ruin because of excessive government spending. Instead of urging the emperor to be more fiscally responsible, the devil suggests a different approach, one with disturbing parallels to our own time. Noting that the empire's currency is gold, the devil says there is surely plenty of undiscovered gold underneath the earth belonging to the emperor. Thus, the devil argues, the emperor can issue paper money for the value of this yet-to-be-found gold, thereby generating fresh monetary resources for the government and solving its debt problem. Not surprisingly, the emperor and his treasurer are delighted with this idea. It means the emperor can avoid making hard economic decisions while simultaneously providing the empire with currency. The devil subsequently deluges the government with paper money, and Faust is praised by emperor and commoner alike. The results, however, are not what are expected. First, paper money does not solve the emperor's spending problem. Instead, the government becomes even more extravagant, knowing it can always print more paper money to cover their ever-growing expenses. Second, the devil has fundamentally changed the basis of the empire's currency. The currency is now based on flimsy paper promises. Thus, long-term monetary security and powerful restraints on extravagant government spending are sacrificed for short-term gain. Goethe's insights go to the heart of many of our most intractable economic problems. In 2009, America's federal government posted a $1.4 trillion deficit. That is 10% of American gross domestic product, a level not witnessed since World War II. Given a choice between cutting spending, borrowing, or inflating the money supply, the third option appeals to many politicians. Like Goethe's emperor, that is exactly what many Western governments did between 1945 and 1980. Short-term relief was bought at the expense of long-term stability. But perhaps the biggest lesson from Goethe's Faust is that self-deception is intrinsic to all foolish acts, including those with an economic dimension. Whenever governments choose comforting economic illusions over difficult economic truths, then, like the devil, they will employ dubious means, such as inflation or public sector indebtedness, to make bad economic policies seem less burdensome to those who will eventually have to pay the price. Self-deception is especially apparent in many European governments' responses to the current economic crisis. Many are refusing to acknowledge that Europe's economic problems have more systematic causes. One cause is several decades of low economic growth. As the Czech president Václav Klaus recently observed, average annual economic growth in the Eurozone countries was 3.4% in the 1970s, 2.4% in the 1980s, 2.2% in the 1990s, and only 1.1% between 2001 and 2009. A similar slowdown, Klaus added, has not occurred anywhere else in the world. A second problem is Europe's profound demographic decline. On current projections, for example, Spain's over 65 population will increase from its present level of 17% to 25% by 2030. That means fewer people working to support growing numbers of pensioners. When low economic growth and declining demography are combined with European welfare states, generous state-provided health and unemployment insurance, early retirement and liberal state pensions, large public sector employment, legislation that emphasizes job security, something eventually has to give. Greece has reached that point. The rest of Europe is struggling to avoid following Greece into the abyss. Despite this, many European governments are proceeding down the path of reform with reluctance. In France, for example, President Sarkozy's government has raised the official retirement age from 60 to 62. That will not strike many as a radical reform. By contrast, Spain's Prime Minister Zapatero is cutting pensions, civil servants' wages, and social programs. He has also promised labor market reform. But Zapatero shows no willingness to force reforms past the trade unions. He will do what he has to do, but always the minimum and without enthusiasm. This reflects a disinclination of many European politicians on the left and on the right to concede that the post-war European effort to use the state to provide as much economic security as possible has encountered an immovable obstacle in the form of economic reality. Yet it is arguable that it also reflects the workings of a potentially deadly connection between democracy and the welfare state. The problem, as Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in his Democracy in America, is that public opinion is the dominant power in democracies. This means that if enough people want expansive welfare programs in a democracy, the capacity for politicians to oppose, for example, the desire of 51% of the population to progressively loot the other 49% is limited. To resist is to court electoral defeat or rioters running amok in the streets of Athens. If the 20th century has taught us anything, it is that we need politicians and citizens who understand the essential wrongness of using the state to support themselves at the expense of others. Implementing such policies does not even require solid majority support from the population. In most democracies, people can only gain political power by building large enough coalitions of support based on a range of often incompatible promises made to sometimes very different interest groups. After being elected, democratic governments are under enormous pressure to use their political power to favor their various supporters if they want to avoid having their followers turn against them. Not surprisingly, many governments decide instead to retain the status quo, despite often being aware of the long-term economic consequences. Unfortunately for Europe, that status quo is no longer fiscally sustainable. The beginning of a proper response is to recognize that a democracy's ability to resist the long slouch towards the soft despotism of the welfare state requires two things. The first is to shift the incentives for economic mobility and security so that they lie in the private sector rather than becoming a recipient of state welfare. This task is very difficult when much of the population already enjoys some measure of state income. Yet it is dwarfed by the immensity of the second challenge, developing a moral and political culture which stresses the wrongness of politicians and citizens using the state to live at other people's expense. This means confronting the self-deception that is part of political discourse in America and Europe today, both at the elite and popular level. If opinion polls are correct, it may well be that, culturally speaking, it is too late for much of Europe. Far too many Europeans now simply assume a generous welfare state as part of the economic landscape. Indeed, the increasing number of older Western Europeans today have no incentive to change. Their attitude might be described as après moi, le déluge. America, however, is a different story. The sheer intensity of resistance to the Obama administration's healthcare legislation was about many things, but it surely reflected the fact that millions of Americans are unwilling to go the way of Western Europe. Successful long-term resistance, however, is going to depend upon Americans understanding that the link between democracy and the welfare state must be broken, and that the only way to achieve this objective over the long term is through facing up to our economic self-deception and recommitting America to some of the very best aspirations of its founding: a love of liberty, an embrace of the virtues needed to sustain freedom, and an unwillingness to delegate to the state the responsibilities that free men and free women owe to each other. Thank you very much.